The hospice smelled like antiseptic and wilting flowers. My grandmother had been gone for 3 hours, and the family was already arguing over the parking validation. I stood in the hallway outside her room, still holding her hand when the nurse came to take her. I didn't let go right away. My grandmother, Ruth, had raised me from age 7 after my parents split apart, and neither of them wanted the inconvenience of a child. She was the one who showed up at my school plays, the one who left soup on my doorstep when I had the flu at 22. The one person in my life who looked at me like I was worth something. My older sister, Vanessa, was already on her phone in the waiting room, speaking too loudly about rescheduling a dinner reservation. She hadn't visited once in the final 2 months. Work, she always said. Always work. The reading of the will was scheduled for that Friday at a law office in downtown Columbus. My grandmother's attorney, a measured man named David Park, had a narrow office lined with wooden shelves and smelled like old paper. Vanessa arrived in a silk blouse, her fiancé hovering behind her like a shadow. My mother came too, even though she and my grandmother had barely spoken in years. I wore the same black dress I'd worn to the funeral because it was the only decent thing I owned. David sat across from us and opened a manila folder with the kind of quiet that made everyone go still. To my granddaughter Vanessa, I leave the Columbus condominium on 5th and Broad, fully paid off, valued at $900,000, and my investment portfolio currently held at First National to be transferred immediately upon verification. Vanessa uncrossed and recrossed her legs. A small smile played at the corner of her mouth, the satisfied kind that said she had already known. To my granddaughter Claire, I leave the farmhouse and the surrounding 94 acres of land in Harrow County, along with all contents of the property and any associated mineral and water rights. The room went very quiet. I had heard of the farmhouse. My grandmother mentioned it occasionally, always briefly, like a footnote in a longer story. A place her own mother had owned, a place that had been sitting empty for nearly 15 years. I had never seen it. None of us had. Vanessa turned to look at me. The smile she gave me then was not warm. It was the kind of smile you give someone when you're explaining something obvious to them. Dirt and weeds, she said. That's what you get. 94 acres of dirt and weeds. She laughed quietly and shook her head. Honestly, Claire, it fits you perfectly. That's exactly what I'd expect for you. My mother looked at the wall. David cleared his throat and kept reading. I kept my face still. I had spent 28 years learning how to do that around Vanessa. She had always been the golden one. The one my grandmother doted on visibly and loudly. She had the better grades, the better boyfriend, the better apartment. She spoke at the right volume and wore the right clothes and laughed at the right times. When we were teenagers, she told me once that I was the reason our parents left. That if I had been easier, more likable, less needy, they might have stayed. I had believed her for a long time. On the drive back, she called me from the parking lot before I even reached my car. I almost didn't answer. You're not really going to hold on to that property, are you? She asked, skipping hello entirely. Because I've already spoken to someone at Halcyon Development. They're expanding out past Harrow County. They'd buy the land sight unseen. Whatever's on it, they don't care. You'd get a real payout. How long ago did you speak to them? I asked. She paused. I've been planning, she said smoothly. Someone has to. You're not exactly known for thinking ahead, Claire. I ended the call and sat in the parking lot for a few minutes, watching the clouds move. Then I looked up Harrow County on my phone. 94 acres, farmhouse, water rights. I didn't know what any of that meant yet, but I was going to find out. The drive out to Harrow County took 2.5 hours. The road narrowed as I left the highway, curving through farmland and low hills and small towns with gas stations and hardware stores and not much else. I had taken Friday off from work and packed a bag the night before without telling anyone where I was going. When I turned onto the gravel road marked with the address David Park had given me, I slowed down and let the car roll. The trees on either side were old, thick-trunked, their canopies touching overhead. They made the road feel like a tunnel, cool and green even in the late morning heat. The farmhouse appeared at the end of it. I stopped the car and just looked at it for a moment. It was not small. That surprised me. I had been picturing something like a hunting shack, something you could mistake for a storage unit. What I saw instead was a 2-story clapboard house with a wide front porch and tall windows, probably built in the 1930s. The paint had peeled badly, and one of the porch steps was caved in. A shutter hung at an angle on the upstairs window. Weeds had pushed up through the gravel and the flower beds had gone wild, but the bones of it were solid. Even from the car I could see that. I got out and walked to the porch. The door was stiff, but the key David had given me worked after a second try. Inside, the air was thick and still. The way houses get when no one has opened a window in years. Sheets covered most of the furniture. A thin layer of dust lay over everything like snow. I pulled the sheet off the nearest chair and sat down in the middle of the living room and looked around at the walls, the fireplace, the old wooden staircase that still looked perfectly sound. I wasn't sure what I was feeling. It wasn't disappointment. My phone buzzed. Vanessa again. I turned it face down. There was a photograph on the mantel that I almost missed. I only saw it because I stood to look at the fireplace. A woman I didn't recognize, maybe 60 years old, standing in front of this same house, laughing at something off camera. On the back, in unfamiliar handwriting, Eleanor 1971. The year we got the creek agreement. I set it back and stood there for a long time thinking about who Eleanor was. I had been at the house about 2 hours when I heard tires on the gravel. I stepped onto the porch to find a red pickup truck idling at the edge of the drive. An older woman climbed out, maybe 70, with short white hair and the kind of unhurried walk that says someone is comfortable in their own body. She called out before I could speak. "You must be Ruth's granddaughter." "I'm Margaret Ellison. I farm the property adjacent east." She held up a foil-covered dish. "Brought you something. Figured you'd show up eventually. Your grandmother said you would." "She knew I was coming?" "She told me," Margaret said, climbing the porch steps with no hesitation. "About a year ago, actually. She said one of her granddaughters would come to the house and that when she did, I'd know which one it was because she'd be the one who came alone and didn't call ahead." I held the door open and let her in. She set the dish on the kitchen table, a casserole of some kind, and pulled out a chair without being invited. She looked around the kitchen with the practical eye of someone assessing a field. "You know anything about this property?" she asked. "Not much," I said. "I didn't even know it existed until 3 days ago." She nodded slowly. "Your grandmother bought the original tract in 1968. Added acreage twice after that. She kept it out of the family conversation deliberately," she said. "She didn't want it fought over." I pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "Why leave it to me?" Margaret folded her hands. "She said you were the only one of her grandchildren who ever asked about her life before you were born. She said your sister only ever asked about the condominium." I looked at the photograph I had set on the counter. Who was Eleanor? Margaret's expression shifted. She smiled. "Eleanor Marsh was your great-great-grandmother. She homesteaded this land in 1934 after her husband died. She raised 4 children here alone, grew her own food, tapped the creek for irrigation. She was the one who negotiated the original water rights agreement with the county." "Water rights," I said. "David Park mentioned that in the will." Margaret leaned forward. "That's what I want to talk to you about. Ruth told me she explained this to you in a letter." "Did you find it?" "A letter?" She pointed toward the back of the house. "Kitchen," she said, "under the floorboard next to the pantry door. She had it put there last summer. Said she didn't trust regular mail." I went to the kitchen and crouched down. The boards were old pine, slightly warped with age. The one beside the pantry door gave when I pressed it. Underneath was a small metal box with a latch. My hands were not entirely steady when I opened it. Inside was a letter in my grandmother's handwriting, a folded document with a county seal, and a second, thicker document held together with a binder clip. I brought everything back to the table. Margaret pointed to the county document. "Open that one first." It was a water rights agreement, renewed most recently 4 years ago, between Eleanor Marsh's estate and Harrow County Municipal Water Authority. In exchange for access to the creek that ran along the property's eastern edge, the county had been paying a quarterly lease. I turned to the payment schedule in the back. My throat tightened. $12,000 a quarter, $48,000 a year. Paid to an estate account my grandmother had never once mentioned. "That's been accumulating for 15 years, Margaret said quietly. Ruth stopped drawing from it when she moved to Columbus, said she wanted to leave it for the right person. I turned pages without being able to fully track what I was reading. And the other document? Mineral survey. Margaret tapped it. The county commissioned it about 6 years ago when they were looking at the groundwater table. They found something they didn't expect. She paused. Low-grade rare earth deposits along the northern ridge. Nothing that makes the evening news, but enough that 2 extraction companies have contacted me about adjacent land in the past 3 years. I set the papers down. Margaret looked at me steadily. Your grandmother knew. She had her own survey done independently after the county's. The estimates aren't small, Claire. I sat there without speaking for a full minute. Outside, the wind moved through the old trees along the drive and made a sound like running water. Then I read the letter. Dear Claire, if you're holding this, then David read the will correctly and you made the drive. I knew you would. I also know your sister has already called you, probably twice. Do not sign anything she sends you. Do not let anyone from Halcyon Development onto this property. They approached me 2 years ago, and I told them no. I need you to tell them the same. Eleanor built this place from nothing. She used to say that land is the one thing people can't manufacture, and that anyone who tries to take yours is admitting they can't build their own. Keep that in mind. I've spoken to David. The estate account is yours. The water rights agreement transfers with the deed. The mineral rights are yours as well. Do not sell the northern ridge. You were the only one who ever asked me what my life was like before you were born. That matters more than you know. Build something here, Claire. Whatever it looks like, just build it yours. I folded the letter carefully. My eyes were burning and I was not going to cry in front of a woman I had just met. So I breathed steadily through my nose until the feeling passed. Margaret let the silence sit for a moment. Then she said, So, what would you like to know about the property? Everything, I said. She smiled. Good. Because we've got a lot of ground to cover. I stayed the weekend. I slept on the couch under a blanket I found in the upstairs closet, which smelled like cedar and something floral I couldn't identify. Margaret brought coffee both mornings and we walked the land together, the creek boundary, the northern ridge, the old orchard in the back that had gone unpruned for years but was still producing, its trees heavy with apples that had fallen and rotted into the grass. By Sunday afternoon I had a rough picture of what the property actually was. It was not a shack. It was not dirt and weeds, not really. Under the surface of the neglect, it was 94 acres of viable land with a paid water rights agreement, a historic farmhouse that needed work but not demolition, a producing orchard, and a mineral survey that 2 extraction companies had already noticed. What my sister had laughed at was worth more than her condominium on 5th and Broad. I drove back to Columbus on Sunday night and did not tell Vanessa I had been out there. She called Monday morning while I was making breakfast. I've been patient, she said, but Halcyon needs an answer. They're moving on other parcels in the area and this window won't stay open. I poured my coffee. You gave them my contact information? She made an impatient sound. I'm trying to help you, Claire. You work 12-hour nursing shifts. You live in a 2-bedroom apartment. You don't have the time or the resources to do anything with 94 acres of nothing. Let me handle it. It's not nothing, I said. What? The property. It's not nothing. And it's not for sale. The silence stretched out. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. That sharp edge she usually kept hidden was right at the surface. Don't do this out of spite, Claire. I know you're upset about the will, but being stubborn about a piece of farmland because you want to prove something is not a plan. I'm not trying to prove anything, I said. I'm keeping what grandmother left me. She hung up. My mother called an hour later, which meant Vanessa had already called her. She used that careful, measured voice she always used when she was trying to smooth something over without actually taking a side. Your sister is just trying to be practical, she said. She has connections. She knows people in real estate. She knows people at Halcyon, you mean, I said. The company grandmother turned down twice. A pause. There's no need to be combative. I'm not being combative. I'm stating facts. She sighed. You've always made things harder than they have to be, Claire. Even as a child. You dig in over nothing. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, It's not nothing, Mom. And I'm not digging in. I'm standing in a place that belongs to me. She had nothing to say to that. We ended the call without resolving anything. The cease and desist letter arrived the following Thursday. Vanessa had retained an attorney and was claiming that our grandmother's mental capacity had been compromised in the final year of her life, and that the distribution of the estate represented undue influence. The letter was dense and aggressive, and full of language designed to make me feel small and legally outmatched. I drove back to Harrow County that same afternoon. I sat at the kitchen table with the letter and Margaret, who had come over when she saw my car in the drive. She read it without expression, set it down, and said simply, "Call David Park tonight." I did. He sounded unsurprised. "I've been expecting something like this," he said. "Your grandmother anticipated it. She had a capacity assessment done 18 months ago, fully documented. She also had a second attorney review the will independently. The grounds your sister is claiming don't exist. But this is about pressure, Claire. She wants you to feel like fighting is harder than settling." "I understand," I said. "Do not contact her directly. Only through me going forward." "That's fine," I said. He paused. "Your grandmother told me once that you were the most quietly stubborn person she had ever known, and that she meant that as the highest compliment she could give. I think I understand what she meant." I smiled for the first time all day. That weekend, Vanessa showed up at the farmhouse unannounced. I heard the car on the gravel and stepped onto the porch before she reached the steps. She was dressed the way she always dressed, like she was walking into a meeting, her hair smooth, her expression calibrated to project reasonableness. She looked at the freshly swept porch, the repaired step I had fixed the previous weekend, the new coat of paint I had started along the porch railing. She said nothing about any of it. "Claire," she said, "we need to talk like adults. I'm listening." She came up the steps and stopped a few feet from me, keeping the tone conversational, almost gentle. She was always better at that register than I was. "I know you're attached to the idea of keeping this place. I get it. Grandmother left it to you, and it feels meaningful. But look at this realistically. You don't have the money to restore it. You don't have time to manage 94 acres on top of your job, and I have a buyer who will make this easy for everyone." "Halcyon," I said. "They're a serious company. They've been circling this property for 2 years. Grandmother said no to them twice." Vanessa's patience thinned slightly. Grandmother was a sentimental old woman who didn't understand what the land was worth. I heard that sentence land in my chest. I breathed once and kept my voice even. She understood it better than anyone. That's why she left it where she knew it would be protected. Vanessa stepped closer. "Don't be naive. I'll contest the will. It'll cost you time and money you don't have. And at the end of it, you'll wish you had taken the deal." I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "You should talk to David Park before you file anything else. He has documentation you haven't seen yet." "What documentation?" "Estate account records, the water rights agreement, the mineral survey, the legal protections grandmother put in place. All of it." Something shifted in her expression. A flicker of uncertainty she couldn't quite suppress. I said, "You laughed at me in that law office. In front of everyone. Dirt and weeds, you said. That fits you perfectly. I'm not sure you understood what you were looking at." She had no answer for that. It wasn't a long silence, but it was complete. She walked back to her car without another word. I stood on the porch and watched her leave. Margaret appeared from around the corner of the house, where she had been pulling weeds in what used to be the kitchen garden. She looked at me over the tops of her glasses. "She looked rattled," Margaret said. "Good," I said. The legal challenge Vanessa filed went nowhere. David Park had done exactly what he told me he had done. The capacity assessment, the secondary review, the documented history of my grandmother's intentions, all of it assembled into a wall that her attorney walked into and bounced off. Within 6 weeks, the filing was withdrawn. I found out through David's office. Vanessa did not call. My mother called. She was careful about it, choosing words the way someone might choose where to step on uncertain ground. She said she had not understood the full picture. She said Vanessa had told her the property was essentially worthless and that she had taken that at face value. She said she was sorry she had not asked more questions. I let her finish. Then I said, I need you to be honest with me about something. She was quiet, waiting. Did you know grandmother was leaving the property to me? Another pause. She told me she was leaving something to you. She didn't tell me what. I assumed it would be jewelry, or the quilts. She stopped. I should have pushed back more. When Vanessa said what she said at the reading, I should have said something. You should have, I agreed. She made a small sound. You sound like your grandmother. I hope so, I said. By fall, I had made 5 more trips out to the farmhouse. I stayed longer each time. I hired a local contractor, a man named Pete, who had grown up 3 miles down the road and knew the property by reputation, to assess the structure. His report was the best news I had received in months. Solid foundation, sound framing, the roof needed replacing, but everything beneath it was intact. Eleanor had built well. Margaret and I walked the orchard one October morning when the light was low and golden, and the apples that were still on the trees smelled like cider. She pointed out the old irrigation channels Eleanor had dug by hand in the 30s. 2 of them were still functional. I have an idea, I told her. She looked sideways at me. I've been waiting for you to say that. I want to open a retreat. Something small, residential. For women coming out of bad situations. Domestic violence. Housing instability. Somewhere they can stay while they get back on their feet, with access to job training, counseling, community. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Eleanor tried to start something like that in 1951. She never had the resources. She told her daughters about it, and they said she was ahead of her time. I looked out at the orchard, at the old farmhouse visible at the end of the path, solid and square against the October sky. I have the resources, I said. The estate account, the water lease, the mineral rights. I have David Park and a property that's already legally bulletproof, and I have 94 acres that have been waiting for something to be built on them for 15 years. Margaret smiled. What are you going to call it? I thought for a moment. Eleanor's house, I said. Margaret stood there quietly. Then she pressed her lips together and nodded once, the way people nod when they are not trusting themselves to speak. It took 14 months. I transferred the mineral survey results to a licensed extraction consultant, negotiated a long-term lease with a regional mining company for the northern ridge that kept the surface land intact, and generated a second income stream. I set up an irrevocable trust through David Park that protected the farmhouse, the orchard, and the creek boundary from any future challenge. The trust named Eleanor's house as the sole beneficiary of any future land transaction. I renovated the farmhouse in phases, starting with the roof and working down. Pete's crew replaced the windows and rebuilt the porch correctly. I repainted the exterior a warm cream with green shutters, close to what it must have looked like when Eleanor was alive. The orchard was pruned and a local agricultural cooperative agreed to harvest it each fall, splitting the proceeds with the foundation. I kept my nursing job through all of it, working nights sometimes to cover the costs before the revenue streams stabilized. I was tired in a way that sat in my bones. But it was different from the tired I used to feel. It had a direction to it. Vanessa did not reach out. My mother drove out to visit in the spring. She stood on the repaired porch and looked out at the land for a long time without saying anything. The cherry trees along the east fence line were blooming, and the creek was audible from where we stood. She said, I told your grandmother once that I thought she favored you. She said she didn't favor you. She said she just recognized you. I looked at her. I didn't understand what she meant then, she said. I think I do now. We had coffee at the kitchen table under Eleanor's photograph, which I had cleaned and reframed and hung where it belonged. My mother told me things about her own childhood I had never heard before. About Eleanor. About the years before I was born. About choices she had made and regretted. We stayed at the table for 3 hours. When she left, she hugged me in the driveway for longer than she usually did. It wasn't everything, but it was real. The ribbon across the front door of Eleanor's house was the same green as the shutters. Margaret cut it. I had offered her the honor twice, and she had deflected twice, and on the 3rd time I simply handed her the scissors and did not give her a choice. The morning was clear and cold, late October, the orchard stripped bare and beautiful behind the house. 12 women were already inside, the first residents, their belongings in whatever bags they had arrived with. A social worker I had partnered with through the county stood near the door checking names on a clipboard. Local press had sent one photographer and one reporter who was clearly younger than I had been expecting. Margaret cut the ribbon and everyone applauded, and I said what I had prepared to say into a microphone borrowed from the church in town, and then I stepped away from the microphone because what else was there to say? The house was open. That was the thing. The house was open, and women who needed a place to stand were standing in it. Later, I walked to the orchard alone. The sun was low, throwing long shadows across the grass. My grandmother's ring, a thin gold band she had left me in a separate envelope marked with my name, caught the light on my finger. Vanessa had called 2 nights earlier, the first time in almost a year. Her voice had none of the smoothness it usually carried. She said she had seen the announcement in the county paper. She said she didn't understand why I had done all of this when I could have just taken the money. Because it was never about the money, I told her. You thought it was dirt and weeds. You were wrong about what I had, and you were wrong about what I'd do with it. She didn't respond to that. I wasn't cruel about it. There wasn't any satisfaction in being cruel. But I didn't soften it either, because it was simply true. She had looked at 94 acres and seen nothing. I had looked at the same land and seen everything Eleanor had left inside it, everything my grandmother had protected and passed down with both hands open. Standing in the orchard with the shadows lengthening and the sound of voices carrying from the open farmhouse windows, I thought about what it means to underestimate something. Vanessa had underestimated the land, and she had underestimated me, and both turned out to be the same mistake. I had spent a long time in my life being underestimated by the people closest to me.